One of the questions parents often ask when they first begin exploring private school admissions is this: what SSAT score do you need for private school? But here's something that surprises many families. Sometimes students with very strong SSAT scores are not admitted to certain schools. And sometimes students with much more modest scores are admitted to highly selective schools, which leaves parents wondering what score actually matters. Sometimes the question is asked very directly. Parents simply want to know what number their child should aim for. But underneath that question is often a deeper concern. Because when families receive their child's SSAT score report, the document can feel surprisingly intimidating. Parents open the report and immediately see several different percentile rankings. There are scores for verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, reading, and often a writing sample that isn't given a numerical score at all. Instead of a single number, families are suddenly looking at a page filled with unfamiliar information. And very quickly, many parents begin wondering something else. Is this score good enough? Did this percentile just determine my child's chances of getting into private school? Should we schedule another test date? Or does this mean our child simply isn't competitive? These are very understandable questions because the SSAT score report is often the first moment families see a number attached to their child's application. And numbers have a way of feeling very definitive. But the reality is that many families misunderstand what these scores actually represent and how admissions committees actually interpret them. Today, we're going to talk about how SSAT scores really fit into the private school admissions process. In this video, we'll explore what SSAT percentiles actually mean, why those percentiles don't tell the whole story, and how admissions committees evaluate testing within the larger application. Because once families understand how testing is actually interpreted, the numbers on that score report often become much less mysterious and much less stressful. Welcome to Admissions Insights. I'm Crystal Stone. Each week, I share reflections and patterns I'm seeing from families navigating private school admissions, so you can approach the process with more clarity, confidence, and calm. Because when families are trying to figure all of this out on their own, the process can feel confusing very quickly. My goal is to help parents see the bigger picture more clearly. Let's begin with one of the most important things to understand about SSAT scores. The percentile on your child's report is not a grade, it's a comparison, and that distinction matters a great deal. When parents see a percentile score, for example, the 62nd percentile, it's very natural to interpret that number the same way we think about grades in school. A 62 might feel like a very low grade. And if parents are used to seeing strong report cards, that number can sometimes feel discouraging. But that's not what the percentile actually represents. A percentile simply shows how a student performed compared with other students taking the same test. For example, a student scoring in the 62nd percentile performed better than 62% of the students in the testing pool. But here's an important detail many families don't initially realize. The SSAT testing pool is not made up of all students nationwide. Instead, it is largely made up of students applying to private schools, many of whom are already academically strong. So the comparison group is already fairly competitive, which means a percentile that might initially look modest can actually represent solid performance within that group. Admissions officers understand this context very well. They read SSAT score reports very differently than many parents expect. Another reason families sometimes misinterpret these scores is that they assume admissions committees are looking for a specific cutoff, a particular percentile that automatically determines whether a student will be admitted. But most private schools do not operate within rigid testing thresholds. Admissions officers review entire applications. They consider transcripts, teacher recommendations, interviews, student writing, and extracurricular involvement. Testing is interpreted alongside all of those elements. In other words, admissions officers are not asking a single question like, is this SSAT score high enough? They are asking something much broader. What does this testing profile suggest about how the student approaches their academic work? Let me show you what that can look like. Imagine two students applying to the same school. One student might have strong classroom grades and teacher recommendations, describing them as curious and engaged, but their SSAT percentiles fall closer to the middle of the distribution. Admissions officers might interpret that profile as a student who performs particularly well in classroom environments. Another student might show extremely high testing percentiles, but more modest classroom performance. That pattern might suggest a different learning style. Perhaps a student who performs very well on standardized assessments, but whose classroom engagement is less consistent. Neither of these profiles automatically determines an admission decision. Instead, admissions committees are trying to understand the student as a whole. Testing is simply one piece of that larger picture. Private school admissions are designed to give admissions officers multiple ways to understand a student. The transcript shows how the student performs across an entire school year. Teacher recommendations describe how that student participates in the classroom. Interviews reveal how the student communicates their ideas and interests. And testing provides a snapshot of academic ability. Admissions officers interpret those pieces together. No single component tells the entire story. And that's an important perspective to keep in mind when looking at an SSAT score report, because the number on that report is not a final judgment about a student's academic potential. It is simply one piece of information. But here's where something interesting happens. The question parents usually ask is, what SSAT score do you need? But admissions officers think about a different question. What score range is typically competitive for the schools this family is considering? And that distinction can make the entire process much clearer. To understand what a good SSAT score actually means, it helps to briefly understand how the scoring process works, because the number that appears on your child's score report is not simply the number of questions they answered correctly. The SSAT scoring process happens in several stages. First, students receive what is called a raw score. The raw score is simply the number of questions the student answered correctly on each section of the test. But SSAT includes something that surprises many families who are used to the ISEE. There is also a penalty for incorrect answers. When students answer a question incorrectly, a fraction of a point can be deducted from the raw score. The purpose of this system is to discourage random guessing. So the raw score reflects both correct and incorrect answers. However, families do not see this raw score directly. Instead, the testing organization converts raw scores into scaled scores. Scaled scores adjust for slight differences in difficulty between different versions of the exam. Because students may take the SSAT on different testing dates, the exact set of questions on the test may vary slightly. Scaling helps to ensure that students taking different versions of the test are evaluated fairly. Once a scale score is calculated, it is converted into the number most families focus on, the percentile ranking. The percentile tells you how your child performed with other students taking the same test. For example, a student in the 70th percentile performed better than 70% of the students in the testing pool. A student in the 50th percentile performed about the same as the middle of the group. And a student in the 90th percentile performed better than 90% of the students who took the exam. At first glance, these numbers seem straightforward, but admissions committees rarely look at a single number in isolation. Like we've discussed, they often look at patterns across the score report. For example, admissions committees frequently look at the balance between sections. The SSAT evaluates several different academic skills. The verbal section measures vocabulary development and language patterns. The reading section evaluates how students interpret written material. The quantitative sections measure mathematical reasoning and problem solving. Sometimes students perform very consistently across all sections of the test. Other times, the profile shows clear strengths in one area. A student might demonstrate particularly strong verbal reasoning and reading scores, but slightly lower quantitative percentiles. Another student might show strong mathematical reasoning, but more moderate reading performance. Admissions officers often find these patterns helpful because they provide clues about how a student approaches learning. A student with strong reading and verbal scores may feel especially comfortable in a discussion-based classroom where literature and analytical writing play a large role. A student with particularly strong quantitative scores may thrive in schools with rigorous mathematics or science programs. These patterns do not necessarily make one student stronger than the other. They simply help admissions officers imagine how the student might engage with the curriculum at their school. Another important detail many families don't initially realize is that schools rarely publish exact SSAT score expectations. Parents often search online for answers like, what SSAT percentile do you need for private school? But private schools rarely publish those numbers. Instead, admissions officers evaluate testing within the context of the applicant pool each year. Some years, the testing pool may be particularly strong. Other years, the distribution may look slightly different. So rather than operating with strict cutoffs, Schools tend to think in terms of general ranges. For many academically rigorous independent schools, SSAT scores somewhere around the 50th to 80th percentile range often fall within a competitive zone. But that range can vary depending on the school and the strength of the applicant pool in a given year. Scores above that range can certainly strengthen an application, but admissions officers are rarely expecting every admitted student to score in the 90th percentile or higher. And students below those ranges are not automatically excluded either, because testing is interpreted alongside the rest of the application. Admissions committees ask a contextual question. Does this testing profile align with what we see in the rest of the application? If a student's transcript shows strong academic effort and teachers describe the student as highly engaged in the classroom, admissions officers may interpret testing scores through that lens. If the testing profile appears dramatically different from classroom performance, admissions committees may take a closer look. Sometimes students simply perform differently in time testing environments. Sometimes nerves play a role. Admissions officers understand that standardized tests capture only a brief moment of performance. They're careful not to treat that moment as the full picture of a student's ability. And this leads to one of the biggest misconceptions families have about the SSAT. When a parent sees a percentile that feels lower than they expected, the first instinct is often to focus entirely on improving that number. Families start asking questions like, should we retake the test? Should we hire a tutor? Should we delay applying until the score improves? And sometimes those steps can make sense. But improving a testing score is not always the most important factor in strengthening an application. Admissions committees are not building classes by ranking students according to SSAT scores. They are building learning communities, which means they evaluate something much broader than testing performance. Admissions officers want to understand how students engage with ideas, how they approach academic challenges, how they contribute to the classroom environment. Testing provides a snapshot of academic ability, but it cannot fully capture qualities like intellectual curiosity, classroom engagement, creative thinking, or collaboration with classmates. That's why admissions committees spend significant time reading teacher recommendations. Teacher recommendations offer something testing cannot provide: insight into how the student actually behaves in the learning environment. Does the student contribute to discussions? Do they approach challenging assignments with persistence? Do they collaborate well with classmates? Do they demonstrate curiosity about the material? Student interviews provide another important perspective. Admissions officers are not simply evaluating whether the student gives perfect answers. They are observing how the student communicates their ideas, how the student talks about learning, whether they show genuine enthusiasm for subjects that interest them. A student who lights up when discussing a favorite part of a book, a science project, or a historical topic often leaves a strong impression, because that curiosity is exactly what many private schools hope to cultivate in their classrooms. This is why admissions officers are looking for what you might think of as a coherent academic story. They want to see the different parts of the application align. The transcript reflects consistent academic effort. Teacher recommendations that describe an engaged learner. The interview reveals the child's intellectual curiosity. And the testing profile supports the overall picture of academic readiness. When those elements align, admissions officers gain confidence in the student's potential. And that confidence often matters far more than the difference between one percentile and another. If you're a parent currently trying to interpret your child's SSAT or ISEE scores and wondering what those numbers actually mean for your school, I've created a workshop that walks through the admissions process step by step. It's called the Private School Admissions Roadmap. In this 35-minute parent workshop, you'll leave with a clear understanding of how private school admissions decisions are actually made, a simple framework for evaluating how competitive different private schools really are, a realistic perspective on how ISEE and SSAT scores are interpreted by admissions committees, and a clearer sense of what families should focus on next in the admissions process. Because once families understand how these pieces fit together, testing, transcripts, recommendations, interviews, and school selection, the entire admissions process is much easier to navigate. You can watch the workshop through the link below. And if you're a parent navigating private school admissions and you want clear guidance each week, I'd invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future admissions insights. Each week, we talk about testing strategies, school selection, admissions timelines, and how families can approach the private school process with more clarity and confidence. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next Admissions Insights.